I know I'm supposed to talk about the sugary beverage campaign, but I actually want to start off with a success. I was bugged during the election by all the polls that were so conflicting in that, so I went to the health statisticians in my department, and I said, use some objective scientific data and make a projection about where the Democrat in the House could kind of hide under the covers and make it through the night. And this is what they came up with, and it's better than Gallup, you know, held on in the Northeast, the Florida coast, around the Great Lakes. That's Jim Matheson, that one blue dog out in Utah, still wiggling and biting at Nancy Pelosi, West Coast, Northwest. So they did a great job. Now, we've got, that's the Politico map, and you can see what a great job we did, actually better than Gallup did. We've still got open races here in New York, and so I'm volunteering to have my folks open up the code, the original data source, and show where they got that from. That's where the Democrats could go to the mattresses and make it through. I hope we can now put to rest that phrase that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, because I actually think terrible policies get made in the grip of a crisis mentality. I'm not going to pretend that obesity is a sudden crisis. It's been an emerging problem for 3 decades. Every decade, the CDC just adds new colors to the map as the flood of obesity crosses the country. It's moving down the socioeconomic scale, so it's hitting the workforce and taxpayers and healthcare consumers of the future. It costs $147 billion, at least 9% of the healthcare budget. And if diabetes doubles, it'll completely overwhelm any idea of bending the cost curve down. It's so serious that it actually impacts national security. You know, the military has one of those really kind of disparaging slang terms for the guys that wash out because they're too heavy. Do you know what they call them? They call them civilians. They call them the next people on your company's health care plan. Exercise and vegetables and better parenting and voluntary industry codes, a war on poverty won't solve this. We have to understand the causes of the epidemic and then make significant changes in our food economy and in our food environment. This is the biggest change in our daily caloric budget over the last 30 years. A huge increase in the number of calories coming in from sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, sports drinks, energy drinks. These are converted to fat just like every penny in a piggy bank makes the piggy bank heavier. It's a remediable cause of the obesity epidemic. Why has this happened? What's special about sugary beverages? Over these decades, they've become increasingly inexpensive. Compared to the consumer price index, the price of carbonated sugary drinks have dropped while fresh fruits and vegetables have risen. So they're too cheap. Over those same years, because of marketing pressures and competition and certain economies of scale, the serving sizes have become larger and larger. Some of us probably remember when this was the standard serving, a 12-ounce can with 2 full glasses. Last spring, I drove about 30 miles on an interstate in the West, and I honestly passed these 4 billboards. 44 ounces, 99 cents, any size soda, $1. This one says, no C-section is average. Utah's first dedicated C-section wing in a hospital for those diabetic, overweight mothers. And then the last one was a liposuction ad. We suck fat. Smart liposuction. They're too heavily advertised. When the culture conditioned children to adore penguins and to want to save the polar bears, immediately you saw penguins and polar bear moms offering great big drinks of sugary beverages to polar bear cubs. If you remember in May, the beverage industry announced with a lot of fanfare something they'd done 2 years ago, which was pull sugary beverages out of the schools. Also in May, McDonald's and Coca-Cola announced $1, any size $1 for those hot summer months when the schools were out. They make sure that the beverages are available everywhere in the world. This kid probably doesn't have mosquito netting, he probably doesn't have tetanus vaccine, but he's got a Coke and a smile. Sugar water calories don't trigger satiety mechanisms. They don't displace other consumption the way even the junkiest of the junk foods do. Look who agrees. Let's see, I may have to touch that here.
It's gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper relative to people's earning power over the years, and which people love. In 200 countries, you have a per capita use going up every year for a product that's over 100 years old. You can drink one of these at 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. The one at 5 o'clock will taste just as good to you as the one you drink early in the morning. You can't do that with cream soda, root beer, orange, grape, you name it. There is no taste memory to cola. And that means that you get people around the world that are heavy users that will drink 5 a day or Diet Coke, maybe 7 or 8 a day or something of the sort. They'll never do that with other products. So you get this incredible per capita use.
Warren Buffett's the biggest investor in Coca-Cola. I actually ran across an obscure, forgotten text by a very obscure figure that gives us an idea about something that we can do with this. Prices can act to coordinate the separate actions of different people. If the price on sugary beverages rises, consumption will drop, and everybody from the American Beverage Association to Tom Frieden at the Centers for Disease Control knows that. Taxing soda is controversial partly because it would be effective. It's a public policy triple play. It would strike at a root cause of the obesity epidemic, it would lower health care costs, and it would raise revenue. The Paterson administration proposed a 1 penny per ounce sales tax on sugary beverages in the 2009-10 executive budget. I actually promoted it on YouTube, maybe some of you saw. I was very proud. I had 76,000 views on that. I thought that was terrific until my staff pointed out that Biscuit, the sleepwalking dog, had more than 10 million views. That winter, I started to work on a sexier sequel that I thought would bring in more views. But the governor gave up. He was confronted by a room full of college students who insisted that they had a right to drink cheap soda. Fortunately, they now also have a right to stay on their parents' insurance policies. We had a familiar set of problems going into the 2010-11 budget, a multi-billion-dollar budget gap, crippling health care cuts, and higher health care costs driven largely by rising rates of obesity. I got a call from the second floor. Would I be willing to take on the fight again, this time as an excise tax with up to $1 billion of revenue going right into health care? My answer was yes, but only if we really went at it full bore. And that was our model. Could we do one good thing in a miserable year? And I think we fought a good fight. The proposal was an active part of the budget debate, such as it was right into early August. Here's an excerpt from this year's Legislative Correspondence Association show. But you all know what happened. At the last minute, they pulled the tax and they substituted a very regressive, sort of pointless tax on low-priced clothing. It must be that the elected officials see typical New Yorkers as underfed but overdressed. Maybe we should get them some tickets to Yankee Stadium. What could go wrong with tickets to Yankee Stadium? And what could go wrong with collecting taxes on Indian reservation cigarette sales and auctioning off a new gambling franchise either? The budget was certified as balanced and put to bed, and then the bedbugs started biting. Notice the very convenient November 2nd date on the announcement of a $315 million budget gap. When it was all over, Crane's Insider buried me and my proposal in their biggest winners and losers of the budget edition. The biggest loser was Dr. Richard Daines. His charts and op-eds were no match for the beverage industry, which stymied a proposed soda tax. Some legislators even said it would keep New Yorkers from feeding their families, indicating an acceptance of the concept that soda is food. But I think we accomplished something beyond frightening the beverage industry and nourishing the lobbying industry. We raised public awareness and moved a wonkish policy debate into the public arena. Here's a clip from a Law and Order Special Victims Unit episode seen last month by 8 million viewers.
Who needs more taxes? Taxes already go to soda. A $4 billion a year subsidy for corn syrup. That's why soda's so cheap.
A tax on sugar water would help pay for the cost of diabetes and heart disease.
Sugar water isn't the only cause for obesity. At least Lindsay was helping the little guy.
The little guy, brought to you by Cola Now. Ah, refreshing. Money put to good use is good.
If Cola Now really cared about poor kids, they wouldn't go plastering their logo all over them.
And here's Julian Robertson, another billionaire like Warren Buffett, on CNBC last week. He says, fight fat by taxing sugar. And I'm actually determined to find a personal something. I'm going to be looking for a job pretty soon, and I couldn't beat the beverage industry, so I'm thinking of joining them with my own product. The question is, why did we fail this time? I think I had a fundamental misconception. I saw it as sort of a public policy initial public offering, and it was a blue chip IPO. We had a great prospectus, we had prestigious backers, Tom Farley, Tom Fried, and others. For me, this was a can't-miss buy and hold opportunity. It had a great ROI, and it promised a long-term guaranteed dividend stream. In the market of informed opinion, our IPO traded very well. The Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, the Times-Union, and the New York Times supported it. We even got the Buffalo News, which is owned by Warren Buffett, and the Syracuse Post-Standard, which I was told would never cross the local bottling industries. They both supported us. Crane's New York Business wrote, "No one likes taxes, but," and then went on to support it. The Daily News gave Tom Farley and me a 2-page color spread. In March, Crane's Insider wrote, "Opponents of a tax on soda are refusing to participate in televised debates with New York State's health commissioner. 3 stations have tried to set up debates, but opponents have declined to go head-to-head." It was easy to keep our hopes up, to think if we made a convincing enough public case, the leadership of the legislature would have to let us pitch the IPO directly to them. We never really even came close, not only to enactment, but even to really making a pitch in front of that decisive legislative audience. What was happening was revealed to me by an insight of my college student son. We'd watched this disastrous meltdown of the world's financial markets, and they were said to be choking on toxic derivatives. The familiar home mortgage market of well-built homes, substantial down payments, affordable mortgages carried to maturity had been transformed. The mortgage brokers were pumping out subprime, nothing down, no income verification products. Mortgage loans were securitized, cut into tranches. Secondary markets stripped off and then traded esoteric derivatives. And then the derivatives ended up insuring the derivatives from which they had been derived, or something like that. The world economy then finally depended on a guy at an AIG trading desk in London. Could he scrounge up enough billions of dollars to carry his toxic derivatives one more night while he looked for a greater fool to take them off of his hands? What did he know or care about whether some family in a housing tract outside of Las Vegas was able to make its mortgage payment? We know how that ended. Andrew and I had been discussing actually healthcare reform, and then later I think we were watching Chris Matthews on MSNBC comment on the way Fox News was covering the way the mainstream media was covering what Sarah Palin and Howard Dean were saying about health care. And Andrew observed that they weren't discussing health care or health care reform. They were trading high-order, no-knowledge-needed, opinion-backed derivatives. He wrote a column for his college paper, and I came to realize that the same thing had happened with our great public policy IPO. It had been stripped and derivatized. We were trying to sell a public policy initiative on its merits and its ROI, and the real action was in derivatives being traded on secondary markets, and we were taking a beating there. I'll give you a recent event to show you what I mean by political derivatives. On August 5th, the mine collapsed, trapped 33 miners in Chile. 70 days later, they were rescued. It was a very simple story. A child could understand it. And the proper reaction was also pretty obvious. But by the next morning after the rescue, the tabloids had stripped and packaged a very exotic derivative that 1 in 33 Chilean men has a mistress. Pundits and politicians all tried to strip and trade their own derivatives. The Tea Party miners would have killed each other. No, capitalism saved the miners. Somehow Obama got dragged into it by Harry Reid. The clown market traded a day's worth of attention for dignity. This is just kind of good, clean, silly fun, but there are some political derivatives that are toxic and persistent. This is an ad that was run in the Texas gubernatorial race. A little bit of background. There's a vaccine for the human papillomavirus that if it's taken before the onset of sexual activity, it can protect girls against the virus that causes most cases of cervical cancer. It's recommended by health authorities. There's a legitimate controversy about whether it should be one of those mandated vaccines or not. Governor Rick Perry in Texas, with the support of the women's reproductive health advocates, took that on and proposed it be mandated. He lost that fight. This is an ad that the Democratic Governors Association.
This is the arm of an 11-year-old girl. Now, imagine a governor who wanted to take a needle, fill it with a controversial drug for sexually transmitted diseases, and inject it in every 11 and 12-year-old girl in Texas. That's what Governor Rick Perry wanted to do. That's what Governor Perry and his drug company friends wanted him to do. On this issue, we've got one thing to say. Not our daughters, and not in our Texas.
So remember, the Democratic Governors Association ran it against the Republican governor in the Texas race. Perry won easily, but somewhere, sometime, a woman is going to get cervical cancer because her parents bought and held on to that toxic derivative. Short-term thinking and selfishness aren't unique to Wall Street at all. There are 3 characteristics of the political derivative market that you can see in this ad. The backers of an IPO may think that the political derivative markets are secondary, but traders in the derivative markets will seek to optimize their outcomes with little regard to what happens anywhere else. The market that mattered to the ad's creators was the Texas gubernatorial election, and the effects on cancer prevention were for someone else to worry about. Day traders thrive in these volatile derivative markets. Immediate profit-taking trumps long-term losses imposed on others. With an election 3 weeks away, why worry about some girl getting cancer 20 years later? And then in a volatile derivative market, often the best position is what's called a naked straddle. A trader makes long and short bets on the same stock, but doesn't actually own the shares needed to back up either position. He earns a volatility premium, they call it, and then he folds both positions without any cost before the strike date. That's actually what I would call a pretty daring political naked straddle when a Democratic organization runs an ad against a Republican governor who's being backed in a policy by women's reproductive health advocates who are typically reliably Democratic constituents. As soon as the sugary beverage tax was announced, 3 secondary markets opened up, stripped off derivatives, and began to trade them against our IPO. Most visibly, the soda tax derivatives were actively traded in a kind of a daily penny stock market of public opinion. Their action there is press releases, sound bites, media events, blog entries, TV, radio, billboard ads, a few sort of telegenic public demonstrations. Public opinion market makers try to create market trends and then trade on the trends that they create. First impressions and labels matter. Did the tax have a chance or was it hopeless? Would the special interest bureaucrat or nanny label stick to someone? Would big government or big beverage be the bigger villain? Who was really on the side of working families? Was it a tax grab or a price correction? Was it needless interference or a helpful signal? Would the revenue be wasted or spent, or better yet, invested? The public opinion polls are the sort of like the stock ticker for this market, and Lady Gaga sets the tone of the market. The opponents of the soda tax were successful in creating and then trading on three trends. First, they convinced the opinion market that the tax was dead on arrival, that it had absolutely no chance of approval. Of course, if it were really dead on arrival, the beverage industry wouldn't have needed to engage so heavily and expensively in fighting it and finally defeating it 7 months later. Dead on arrival was actually a very effective opening tactic. It worked to suppress public discussion, but even more importantly, it meant that if it was dead on arrival, then the legislature didn't have to be drawn into what could have been a very uncomfortable debate about the relative merits of the soda tax versus their own alternatives to deal with the budget deficit and with obesity. The proposal stayed on the table until August, and that's not bad for a dead on arrival in January proposal. As a physician, I actually envy this naked straddle by the lobbyists. They declared it dead on day one and then earned a $13 million insurance premium for keeping it dead. When I was practicing medicine, once I signed the death certificate, I had to stop pocketing the insurance money. We lost the battle of labels. Our obesity-fighting excise tax on sugary beverage concentrates too long. It was just a fat tax in the headlines to the bloggers and in the polls. Fat tax very reliably triggered anti-tax, anti-nanny state sentiments, and it raised personal sensitivities about weight in 60% of us. It was great market timing for 2010. Here we were floating a big government, meddling, tax and spend, pointy-head liberal IPO that attacked patriotic icons and called everyday Americans fat. I'm a great market timer, aren't I? Our opponents successfully played a naked straddle that the tax was an insult to the ability of families to make responsible consumption decisions, and at the same time an inescapable burden on those same families because they wouldn't responsibly reduce consumption in response to the price. Faced with an increased soda price, budget-challenged families will either reduce their soda consumption or they'll ignore the price signal and consume the same amount at the expense of their food budgets, but they won't do both, as this naked straddle implied. You can see this naked straddle in the following ads. First, any government intervention to reduce consumption says we think consumers are too dumb to do the right thing on their own. And then the straddle. The government actually wants and expects consumers to just stupidly go on drinking too much despite the higher price. Note the sponsor of the ad. You probably can't see it. It's the New Yorkers Against Unfair Taxes. This is a cruel cartoon from our opponent's website that actually picks that up. They place the responsibility for consumption on obesity and for obesity on parents, and then they sneer when parents fail. We argue that an avoidable tax on an unessential luxury is no more regressive than a tax on gambling. Price elasticity models and empiric studies demonstrate that low-income families will reduce their consumption to stay within their budgets. Robert Durlak in my public affairs group produced some very nice ads making this point. Sugar-sweetened beverages in a grocery cart and cotton candy in a grocery cart are absolutely identical from a nutritional point of view, but who would object to a tax on cotton candy? New York City pitched in, but we really never escaped those false first impressions that the soda tax was dead on arrival, it was a discriminatory fat tax, and it was both an unwarranted insult to responsible families and an unavoidably regressive burden because those families would be irresponsible about their consumption. And you can see this play out in the stock ticker. The public actually seemed to long for legislative courage and creative thinking to get out of this budget trap. But when they were confronted with an innovative proposal that, yes, it did require legislative courage, when it was called a fat tax or an obesity tax, they turned thumbs down on it. Now, given more information, it turns out that people can be persuaded. If you tell them it's a tax on soda and other soft drinks to reduce childhood obesity, 58, more than 70% of people at least say maybe. So you can see why our opponents wanted to declare it dead on arrival and keep public discussion at that kind of Lady Gaga level. The message to the elected branches about out-of-the-box thinking was the same thing I tell my cat. Never, ever think outside of the box. Then the next market is the media market itself, and it trades in viewers and readers and eyeballs and circulation and ratings and buzz. And frankly, to me, it seems kind of troubled and introspective impressions. To visit editorial boards around the state, I'd often walk through a newsroom of mostly empty desks, and the editors would kind of be huddled in a back room. There'd be old front pages on the wall there, and they seemed actually kind of nostalgic for a real rigorous public debate in which they might actually move opinion. Broadcast media interviews often begin with a young reporter setting up her own camera, glancing at a sheet of paper and blurting out, "Your opponents say the fat tax is an example of the creeping nanny state. What say you?" And you get maybe 30 seconds to answer. And then there was something, the very puzzling, what I call the blonde ratio. About 3% of the human race is blonde, and that's probably a pretty good estimate of the share of brains and ambition allocated to blondes. One morning before I did an appearance on Fox in New York City, Diane Mathis, who's here somewhere, and she'll remember that, we calculated that 80% of the headshots of the female on-camera talent were of blondes. What's the value system that produces that ratio? Since we didn't have funds for paid media, getting on air for us meant inventing a catchy soundbite, offering a personal angle, or providing a combative tone for an on-air debate. All that said, I've actually found editorial boards and media figures willing to listen. They were generally well-informed, they were suitably skeptical, and they were willing to take a fresh look at the issue. Witness the support of the Buffalo News, owned by Warren Buffett, the Syracuse Post-Standard, and Cranes. Even Bob McManus at the New York Post didn't swallow our opponent's junk science or the economic doomsday arguments. He just said, "We're allergic to new taxes." A fair argument. But in the end, the action in the market of informed media opinion probably had little effect on the course of our campaign. Now, people often say that confidence in the press is low. I think even more, the media's ability to hold, let alone shape public attention is waning. Every quarter, newspaper circulation drops. Broadcasted media markets are fragmenting. The strategy seems to be to win and hold on a particular market niche by offering only the facts and opinions to which a particular subset of viewers is likely to already agree and be comfortable with. During our campaign, Warren Buffett appeared on CNBC to talk about the tapeworm of healthcare costs, to tout Coca-Cola, and to very specifically, with Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, attack the New York state taxes, ineffective and unfair and everything bad about government. We couldn't get on CNBC to contradict him with the links between soda consumption and obesity and healthcare costs. But fortunately, Julian Robertson, who's a big player in that market also, was welcome there to say what he said. A third powerful market quietly stripped and traded its own soda tax derivatives. I'll call this one the Albany hidden persuaders market. That's this sort of under canopy ecosystem of lobbyists, advocates, political consultants, media advisors, fundraisers, and AstroTurf grassroots organizations. The persuaders market is remarkably stable and prosperous. It thrives across Republican and Democratic administrations and across boom and bust cycles. It's a very forgiving refuge after any kind of a setback. The persuaders' real target is in the elected branches. And their market strategy in our campaign was to keep the legislative market closed to us, to make sure that the legislature was bottled up and safe from being drawn into what could have been an uncomfortable debate about alternatives. The soda tax was probably the kind of policy IPO that the persuaders market loves. It was an important public policy supported by logic and evidence and informed opinion and opposed by wealthy interests. For them, it was a 7-month, $13 million bull market rally. The traders in this market don't necessarily wish a humiliating final defeat on an IPO. The persuaders actually like a kind of a near-run thing, an against-the-odds but temporary rescue of their clients' interests. Afterwards, there's nothing the persuaders like better than a free advertisement for their services. Note, by the way, where our friends at New York Who's Against Unfair Taxes came from. This is essentially an advertisement. They probably put this in lucite and put it on their desk to impress potential clients for the next campaign. These three markets was where the action seemed to take place, but they were secondary at best to the two where the fate of our IPO was actually determined. Big beverage, the affected industry, was the most critical market. And you have to know, if I agree with Al Gore on something, it must be a fundamental fact of the universe, not merely an opinion. But I do agree with Al Gore. Large commercial interests affected by the tax decided its fate. And I underestimated their reaction. They loathed it. Why? Let me start with another famous Buffett statement about cigarettes. Cheap to make, highly profitable, great brand loyalty, and addiction to boost sales. He made huge investments and took huge profits. And I want you to note the date, 1987. More than 20 years after anyone of his intelligence paying attention knew that cigarettes were causing millions of deaths. But he didn't pull out of the cigarette business until taxes and regulation and public opinion made it an unattractive investment. Now he and others are heavily invested in another industry characterized by low costs, high profits, great brand loyalty, and ineffective satiety mechanisms. And it causes immense harm. We can't wait 20 years for them to come around. And here we were threatening to actually change the business fundamentals. Billions are invested in creating the role that sugary beverages occupy in our economy and culture. Profit margins exceed 20%. Coca-Cola counts on international sales doubling by 2020. Remember the polar bears and the penguins? Here's another Super Bowl ad from a couple of years ago. Beautiful little girl, mommy and daddy together. Charlie Brown gets the great big bottle of Coke. And by the way, the music is the overture to the Marriage of Figaro, because she heard it probably in utero on the Mozart Makes You Smarter beta tape. This concept is called Smash Your Brand. It's actually named after the Coca-Cola bottle. The goal is to embed the product's identity so deeply in the brains of consumers that even a small green-blue curved shard of glass says, you deserve a Coke today. And they call it Smash Your Brand after what Coke has accomplished. The advertising industry actually does these high-powered functional magnetic resonance imaging studies to see which strategies produce hyperactivity in the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is where deep religious conviction is supposed to have a home, and that's where they think the kind of brand identity they want to create also has a home. That's where they want unsmashable brand loyalty, and they'll use polar bears and penguins and Santa Claus and Charlie Brown and Mozart Makes You Smarter to get kids started on that pathway. Billions of dollars and a century of marketing have gone in to convince each successive generation of consumers that the brands built around sugary drinks are synonymous with health, youth, and happiness. This business can't let that model be smashed. And how these wonks were threatening to dictate a fundamental package redesign. After 30 years of them saying cheaper and bigger, we were going to force them to say smaller and more expensive every time they served a drink. Every time all that expensive conditioning with Santa and penguins told a consumer to reach for the big sugary drink, it would collide with an equally powerful and unavoidable price signal to switch to the smaller or sugar-free alternative. It was sort of Frederick von Hayek against Santa Claus in the end. Big Beverage also feared that once the tax passed in any one big state, it would sweep across the country because every state needed that triple play of combating obesity, lowering health care costs, and raising revenue. The industry couldn't give up, so it watered the AstroTurf and paid for the campaigns. It totaled at least $13 million by the end of the campaign. Soda tax derivatives were traded briskly in the public opinion and media and persuaders market for more than 6 months. We even made the affected industry stand up and pay some attention. But the market we really wanted to break into, to have access to, was the legislature. Would we get a chance to actually make the pitch there, to engage them in a back and forth? And that was my biggest disappointment in the process. We never got through the door. We were told to concentrate on the Senate. The Assembly might not stand in the, would not stand in the way, but it wasn't going to stick its neck out either. Could we get a hearing in the Senate? The Democratic majority was supposedly progressive and public health oriented. It was absolutely stuck on the same problems as the administration: the deficit, the cuts to health care, rising health care costs, and obesity. The Senate leadership was from the same minority neighborhoods where food insecurity, high soda consumption, obesity, and diabetes were concentrated. On this map, the red outlines show the largest number of individuals on food stamps. The deeper blue shows the rate of obesity, and the big red dots show the rate of soda consumption. You can see they match up almost perfectly. They also match up quite perfectly with where a lot of the Senate leadership was drawn from. I practiced medicine right there for 19 years, and I do a great job. The constituents of the Senate leaders were the prime victims of the soda-obesity link. Look at the rate of diabetes mortality in the Black non-Hispanic population. Look at the rate of amputations for diabetic problems in those same neighborhoods with soda consumption, food stamp dependence, and obesity, and again, the neighborhoods of the Senate leadership. Warren Buffett, by the way, doesn't live in any of those neighborhoods. These were the districts also where the healthcare industry was the largest employer and where it was the most financially fragile. But we didn't get a real hearing. We watched them do a three-way naked straddle. Opposition to any new taxes, opposition to the healthcare cuts that would be necessary if we didn't bring in revenue with new taxes, and a demand that something be done about healthcare costs and obesity. These were mutually inconsistent positions, and all of them were folded at the last minute to patch together a budget for a few months. Three characteristics of the Senate came into play over the last 2 years that probably dictated that outcome. The first was the 32-30 split that gave any one individual majority member extraordinary power to block any action. And again, I spent long enough in those neighborhoods in the Bronx to know what at least one of the members would do. Second, gerrymandering and the concentration of their own power in minority-majority New York City districts actually seemed to prevent the Senate leadership from addressing the disproportionate victimization of their own constituents by obesity. Because their own re-elections in those heavily impacted inner-city neighborhoods were too certain to be threatened by either the proponents or the opponents of the tax, it fed into the fact that the prospects for remaining in the majority were leveraged onto a handful of mostly outlying districts where obesity and the healthcare industry's troubles were secondary to concerns over taxes, the heavy hand of Albany, and the need to accumulate campaign funds for the upcoming elections. And our opponents exploited each of those openings. Finally, the Senate's instability over the last 2 years worked against it and against us. Think of the national election last week. The Senate did exactly what the founders intended it to do. It was a break on too rapid of a swing of public opinion. We had the biggest switch in the House of Representatives since what, the storming of the Bastille or something like that. But the Senate majority and the Senate leadership survived. Higher qualifications, longer terms, geographic diversity, and that brake against instability worked. As Madison wrote, another effect of public instability is the unreasonable advantage it gives to the sagacious, the enterprising, and the moneyed. A state of things in which it may be said laws are made for the few, great injury results from an unstable government. No government, any more than any individual, will long be respected without being truly respectable, nor be truly respectable without possessing a certain portion of order and stability. Stability, respectability, and seriousness of purpose are what we wanted, and I think what the public wants from its political marketplace. Our IPO failed, and I'll leave it to others to discuss whether the market, the political market, also failed. Thank you.